All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, welcome today to our webinar, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are going to give people a few more minutes to join before we actually get to our speakers. But in the meantime, I'm just going to go through a little housekeeping for everyone on the webinar. All the registrants are muted, so the only people who will be able to hear right now are the panelists. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but if you want to submit a question at any time, you can just type it into the chat box, which is on the right side of your screen. If something comes up that you want to have us address at the end of the webinar, just go ahead and type it in so you don't forget it. If you don't see your chat box, you may have to look for a little orange arrow in the upper right of your screen. That's where it should be. And if you click on that, the chat box should appear. We are recording this webinar, so you will be able to access the information afterwards or to pass it on to others if you find it particularly interesting. We'll have the webinar up on our website probably sometime tomorrow. I'm very excited about this webinar. I think that the new legislation and rules in California are going to make a big difference in how infill development is seen, and I'm very excited to hear from our speakers about how that's going to be implemented. So joining us today, and I realized that I am not showing my screen. Oops. Joining us today are three speakers, one from each of three agencies. Kate White is the Deputy Secretary for Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination at CalSTA. In September 2003, Governor Brown appointed her as the Deputy Secretary for CalSTA. Prior to joining the agency, she spent 2 decades in the environmental development field, including as Initiative Officer at the San Francisco Foundation's Great Communities Collaboration, Executive Director of the Urban Land Institute Bay Area District, Founding Executive Director of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition, and Founding Co-Director at City Car Share. Kate also worked at the Urban Ecology and the National Low-Income Housing. Kate earned her bachelor's degree in political science at Oberlin College and a Master of Public Administration degree from San Francisco State University. Our second speaker will be Chris Ganson, and he's a senior planner at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. He works on transportation transportation planning in that office. Previously, he worked at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the World Resources Institute, the US EPA, and he earned his master's degree in city planning and transportation engineering from UC Berkeley. And finally, we will be hearing from Kome Ajise. He is the Deputy Director of Planning and Modal Programs at Caltrans, which is the California Department of Transportation. He began his career at Caltrans in 1987 in the Fresno district. He later served as the North Region Environmental Chief from 2001 to 2004, and then as the District 10 Director in Stockton, California. He's currently working in the Caltrans headquarters in Sacramento. Kome has a BS in Geography from and Regional Planning from the University of Benin, Nigeria, and a Master's of City and Regional Planning from CSU Fresno. And for those of you who may not be completely familiar with SSTI, I just do want to give you a little information about that. SSTI, we are a network of reform-minded state DOTs. We were founded in 2010 and housed at the University of Wisconsin. We work in 3 ways. We're a community of practice where participating agencies can learn together and share experiences as they implement innovative smart transportation policies. We also are a source of direct technical assistance to the agencies on transformative and replicable smart transportation reform efforts. And finally, we're a resource to the wider transportation community, including local, state, and federal agencies. And that is how we are doing our webinars here. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn this over to our first speaker. Just a moment. And that would be Kate. And okay, Kate, you should have control of the webinar now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Robbie, and thank you to SSTI for having us and inviting us to present today. We are excited to talk about what's going on in California and what we see as a potential paradigm shift from the level of service to vehicle miles traveled as the new metrics to measure traffic impacts. This is a law that was signed by the governor in the fall to change our California Environmental Quality Act, but I think it has much larger implications for, because LOS I know is used in many different venues across the country. And I think that's why SSTI was interested in having us speak about what's going on in California, because hopefully we can learn from what we're doing here. So I'm going to kick off a little bit with the policy context and some of the problems with LOS, why we recommended the governor sign the bill in the fall. And then I'm going to hand it off to Chris from the Office of Planning and Research, who's in consultation with many stakeholders. We'll talk about why they have settled on VMT, vehicle miles traveled, as the new metric to measure traffic impacts. And then Kome is going to finish here with focusing on the implementation of the new law. So how is Caltrans, our State Department of Transportation, going to comply with the new law, with the new VMT metric for both land use projects, which Caltrans reviews many land use projects across the state, and also for our own transportation projects as a state DOT, what are the implications? So with that, I wanted to start off with LOS and a little explanation of what we see as the challenges of LOS as a metric and how it kind of has some perverse effects in discouraging exactly the kind of land use patterns that we are looking to see more of in California. There's many laws that call for more infill development, more compact growth, more transit-oriented development, and yet LOS, as it's utilized under our Environmental Quality Act, actually has a bias against infill. And this first slide shows a hypothetical infill project in a sort of more dense urban grid area, and this project is proposed. And the problem with using LOS is that when you look at the traffic impacts, while it is a walkable, transit-oriented area, dense area, there's when you use LOS, while there's little vehicle travel loaded onto the network, that's the blue dots coming out from the project, there's numerous LOS impacts. So all those intersections in the orange are triggering C to D, D to E, E to F kind of impact in those intersections. And so that is what happens with infill and LOS. On the other hand, now your screen should be showing a proposed greenfield development way on the edge of the region, more of a sprawl style project, low density, outskirts. And with this type of project development using LOS, typically, 3 or 4 times the vehicle travel is generated from this type of project compared to the infill project we were talking about a moment ago. But there's relatively few LOS impacts, so that orange dot is the one intersection where there's an impact under LOS. But in reality, the traffic generated by this outlying project is pretty extensive, much higher, though it's dispersed across the region. And so even though it's triggering LOS, or not triggering LOS rather, it still is contributing broadly to regional congestion problems, more than the infill project. So that's a little explanation of why, sort of a graphic illustration of the challenges with LOS. And just to elaborate a little further, some of the issues, one, as I was saying, bias against infill development because of that last-in development problem. Infill loads relatively little traffic onto the regional network, but LOS methodology adds traffic generated by infill to existing traffic, triggering those thresholds. Secondly, and I think this was also well illustrated by those graphics, is that the analysis is too small. It's very focused on LOS on intersections, and it may miss the impact regionally of how much travel is happening, and not looking at a whole corridor or network, rather just intersections. Another issue with LOS is that the mitigation is problematic. Often LOS calls, if you have an LOS-F, you're going to want to have a smaller project, and that flies in the face of our goal of higher density development. Or you'll want to push it out further where there isn't as much of an LOS impact, which again is sort of encouraging sprawl. Further, widening roadways worsens livability, induces vehicle travel, so that type of mitigation is really not desirous. And then also, LOS mischaracterizes transit, biking, walking as detriments to transportation. So a transit priority lane worsens LOS even as it improves person throughput. So you can have more people traveling, but worse LOS. And it really characterizes pedestrians, cyclists as obstructions to cars to be channeled or restricted. And that little photo on the bottom, I think most of us have experienced that at some point, trying to walk and you can't cross there to try to solve a LOS problem, probably. And then finally, while LOS has a well-developed methodology, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's pretty extensively used. It's not particularly precise more than other metrics. And finally, the focus on delay-based metrics, so how much time cars are spent in traffic, is problematic for modern transportation planning. So rather than thinking about how much delay at particular intersections or certain sections, how much a car is delayed, we need to focus instead on access to destinations. And with smart growth, delay metrics sometimes get that backwards. And the little illustration to the right there is actually a study from Denver that looked at over time from '82 to 2007, while there was a significant population increase and there was increase in delay, travel time actually decreased, and so average travel time. And so why anybody knows what's been happening in Denver lately, a couple things: significant investment in infill, so people don't have to travel so far to their jobs, and then also a tremendous investment in transit light rail system. I think one of the most aggressive in the country. So while cars experience more travel delay, on average, residents were able to get to work faster using transit. So with that, I think I want to thank SSTI again for the invitation. This collaborating on 743 was an early action item from the SSTI report that we was commissioned by my boss, Secretary Kelly, here in California, and we are very pleased to be moving on that and working with OPR and Caltrans to make sure that it's implemented well. So I think I will turn it over to Chris from the Office of Planning and Research, Governor's Office of Planning and Research, who will get a little bit more into, under the law, they were really charged with coming up with the regulations, so he can tell you about that.
Okay, thank you. And Chris, you should have control. Just click on the slide and you should be able to change things.
Terrific. Let's see. Let me use the mouse.
There you go.
There we go. There we go. Hopefully I didn't save up my attempted clicks from before. Chris Ganson from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Thanks also from my seat. It's a pleasure to be able to let you all know what we're up to here in California and tell you a little bit about this, this law we're in the middle of implementing. So SB 743 requires my office to develop new metrics for transportation impacts under our environmental law, under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. It tells us that the metrics shall promote, first, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this is the statute, straight from the statute. Shall promote development of multimodal transportation networks and shall promote a diversity of land uses. So those are not transportation objectives per se, but environmental and planning objectives. And I will add to those. That's what the statute says, and we're also keeping in mind a number of other goals of the administration. One is a law in the books. We have a state planning priorities law, which prioritizes infill here in California. We're also keeping an eye on environmental benefit more generally. So greenhouse gases are called out in the statute, but we're looking at not only emissions, including greenhouse gases from transportation, but also sort of the one-offs. As more vehicle travel is generated, you need to build more roads, and those present more impermeable surface, creating more runoff, flood hazard, and water quality problems. It's been shown through studies that more transportation efficient development tends to have smaller unit sizes and more attached units, and that leads to both building energy savings and water savings in irrigation. You have a smaller lawn to water. Of course, more compact development also means you get to keep more of your agricultural land and sensitive habitat, and those are high priorities in California. You know, et cetera. There's a number of environmental issues that we're keeping an eye on in this endeavor. Health, public health has made it on pretty strongly to the radar screen of transportation in recent years. The public health folks that we are in communication with, our public health folks here in the state, have been telling us that providing opportunities for active transportation is among, if not the biggest thing that public health can do for our public health. So it's a big deal, and we're keeping that in mind, along with active transportation opportunities. Of course, emissions, as we've been keeping an eye on and taking action on for a few decades now, and vehicle collisions, another impact on health. So we're also keeping an eye on fiscal issues, it turns out that in our state, few jurisdictions really have a handle on how they're going to pay to maintain the existing transportation infrastructure. So, so adding additional transportation infrastructure we want to do with great care. And we're looking for a metric that is simple and feasible. We want the environmental review and transportation analysis to be able to be done quickly and in a streamlined fashion. So we're looking for a metric that's at very least easier than what we are doing now. So we put out a draft list of metrics and description of them at the beginning of the year, discussion of them, I should say. And I'll talk just briefly about them now. The statute suggested that we consider vehicle miles traveled and automobile trips generated. So we had a look at both those. We also, stakeholders brought in a few other metrics, brought them to our attention. Multimodal level of service was one, fuel use, vehicle hours traveled. So just talk briefly about how we got to choosing vehicle miles traveled. Multimodal level of service we had a look at, and it has a lot of the same problems that in this context especially, it has a lot of the same problems as automobile level of service in that it just looks right around the project and sees where you have an impact. And so infill development tends to get hit hard, and other development not so much. It doesn't do much towards kind of looking at the bigger picture. Fuel use and vehicle hours traveled, they do look at the bigger picture, but they're much more difficult to model. They require a lot more data and a lot more modeling horsepower. Automobile trips generated, on the other hand, is calculating that as the first step of any of these. It's very easy to calculate automobile trips generated, but it doesn't have the information embedded in it of how long the trips are. And so it misses kind of a or the major piece of the impact of vehicle travel. I'll add, so we did land on vehicle miles traveled, and I'll add that we also saw that certain transportation efficient areas generally don't generate, just because of their location, a lot of vehicle travel, a lot of transportation impact. And so we're looking at, and the draft we're going out with soon, we're going to offer a presumption of less than significant impact for certain geographies based around transit. So vehicle miles traveled, what are the benefits of this metric? First, it's easier to model than automobile level of service. As I think most of you probably know, LOS requires you to model not just trip generation, but also trip distribution. You have to know where everybody's going to know what intersection they're going through, and then you have to run do the modeling that shows you, well, given that traffic going through that intersection, how much will it slow people down or on that roadway segment. So calculating vehicle miles traveled is simply trips generated times average trip length, which can be calculated more in the aggregate. We're already calculating vehicle miles traveled as part of our estimating of greenhouse gas emissions for projects, and we've been doing that for a number of years. Vehicle miles traveled is more accurate, mostly, or in large part because, or I should say in part because, it is a more aggregate metric. Again, you're not looking at a certain intersection and trying to predict what's going to go on a long time in the future. You're looking kind of more broadly at what the project, how much VMT it will generate or attract. VMT captures the full extent of vehicle travel, so it doesn't have that problem where it just looks at the surrounds and leaves the region to suffer regional congestion by 1,000 cuts. It's the mitigation for VMT. Fixing VMT doesn't have that problem where fixing it undoes where the fix is undone by the fix itself. VMT measures to reduce VMT won't induce additional vehicle travel as measures that would increase capacity would. And that, of course, has implications for environmental factors. In general, VMT we see is quite in line with most environmental and human health factors the things we're trying to improve on that front, and with a broad array of other goals, including, as I mentioned, fiscal health. So how will we assess VMT impacts? And here are a couple methods that we are offering. First, a trip-based calculation. I figure everyone on this call is probably familiar with the basic trip-based calculation. And in this case, we would look at residential through a VMT per capita lens, office VMT per employee, commercial, or other land uses VMT per trip or trip length. Some jurisdictions are likely to look at that have more sophisticated modeling capabilities and/or additional data, in particular vehicle occupancy data, maybe looking at a VMT per person trip, so we're providing for that as well. But there will be some projects which will have vehicle travel generated or attracted that will actually, when you look closer, or maybe I should say look from a broader view, will actually act to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And an example here is a grocery store in a food desert. So you put a grocery store where there isn't one for miles, and folks who have had to drive a long way to get to the grocery store in the past now can drive a short way to get there. And you can look at the big picture and see that the total VMT is reduced as a result of the project. So we want to offer that pathway of analysis as well. So now I'll run through the different sorts of projects that will be analyzed and look briefly at the old way, looking through the LOS lens, and the new way, looking through the VMT lens. Kate already showed you this one, so I'll be brief. The land use project, you'll do you did an LOS analysis on local intersections and highway segments, and those trigger impacts. The new way, vehicle miles traveled, will look at the vehicle miles traveled loaded onto the roadway network. And we're talking with Caltrans. They're just in the beginning of this, so we have some development to go on this, but looking into a VMT loaded onto state highways to measure impact to the state highways. And this is important because under an LOS analysis, if you're building a project that just happened to be close to a congested interchange, you're likely to trigger an impact and be responsible for mitigating that traffic impact with a VMT metric. You'll be looking. It'll be a fairer way to distribute the mitigation efforts that projects are responsible for. So with transit and active transportation projects, the difference is quite pronounced, and Kate alluded to this in in her presentation. In the past, what we've had is transit and active transportation projects will slow automobile traffic down. For example, a bus rapid transit line will take some space on the roadway, triggering LOS impacts. And so that bus rapid transit line, which increases person throughput on the corridor, nevertheless has to figure out a way to accommodate automobile travel below the LOS thresholds. Now, this is quite out of line with a lot of what we're trying to do in California on a number of levels, including environmental, this, remember, being our environmental law. And so a shift to VMT in nearly all cases in active transportation or transit project will reduce vehicle miles traveled. And in fact, in the guidelines draft where they stand now, we're looking to offer a presumption of less than significant an expectation that it would reduce vehicle miles traveled to save these projects the calculation in a lot of cases. And for roadway expansion projects, so the way we've been doing this is, again, the LOS. We look at traffic impacts through the LOS lens. And of course, if you're expanding a roadway along that roadway, you're going to make LOS better. That's going to lead to some traffic rerouting and induced vehicle travel. And that travel then will go onto other roadways. And as we do things now, we look at the LOS impacts of that additional travel or that rerouted travel and mitigate that. I would note also that we do look at VMT and the induced VMT from a roadway expansion project for greenhouse gas emissions calculations. And so that's something we've been doing for a number of years. Now, it is true that we haven't been doing that perfectly, that we've been sorting out our methodologies and such, and there's some reports that do that very well and others that miss some pieces of it. But that analysis is nothing new to us. So the new way is not so new. It's just that we're going to be using it as our transportation metric, looking at the induced, or in some cases, a roadway expansion project can reduce VMT, but looking at that as our impact. And just to get a little bit deeper into how the mechanisms of the VMT increases that result from a roadway expansion project. Of course, when you make it quicker to travel by car, people operate on time budget and they'll take longer car trips. They'll also generally, mode shift will follow investment. You can make it easier to drive in a car. People will mode shift towards that. Route changes can actually add VMT or subtract VMT. It depends on the case. And in highly congested areas, you'll actually get newly generated trips. In the long run, and that generally means several or more years, you'll actually affect land use. So when you expand a roadway, that leads to more dispersed land use development because people go further because they can more easily. And that's been, all those effects together have been studied. There's, I think, 30-plus studies on this topic. A number of them are summarized in a recent California Air Resources Board policy brief. I have the link on the slides here. And basically, the quick take-home is that if you increase lane miles by 10%, you will increase vehicle miles traveled in the long run by 6 to 10%, generally speaking. So travel demand models are able to capture most of these effects, and the land use piece, however, is not able to be captured by travel demand models. That needs to be estimated by a separate land use model, and those are by and large not ready yet. So what we've done in the cases where we've done a good job on this is use expert panels and or do the travel demand model run and then compare the results to the empirical literature and account for the difference. Tools for estimating vehicle miles traveled. I think I've mentioned that there's the sketch models. There's about 24 that we've seen currently available. A handful of those are in pretty frequent use in California, some of which are free and downloadable. For a simple project, you could download the model and do the assessment in an afternoon. And they're rapidly improving. Those are useful for land use projects and land use plans for assessing VMT for those. Travel demand models can be used for those and transportation projects as well. And we happen to have invested $10 million recently in our state's regional travel demand models, and so that should bear some fruit for this effort. Logistics and next steps. We are finalizing the draft. We're about to release the draft CEQA guidelines that will contain the details about what I'm talking about soon. And if you want to make sure you're notified about that, go to the URL on your screen and sign up for either or both the CEQA and SB 743 e-lists. When we have gone out and gotten comments and read them all and adjusted the draft to account for those comments, when we're satisfied that it's in good shape, we will be submitting the draft guidelines to the resources agency, to our resources agency, for a formal rulemaking process. We expect that to take half a year, maybe a little bit more, and we expect to see this go live in early-ish 2015. As things stand now, we're looking at an opt-in period where outside of the localized areas around transit, you can opt in or wait to shift from LOS to VMT, and then a full shift for everybody having converted by January 2016. And I will stop there and pass the mouse microphone floor to Kome Ajise, who is going to talk about what Caltrans is doing to implement this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Kome, I have given you control of the slides, so just click on that one and you should be able to change them.
Thank you, Robbie. Again, my name is Kome Ajise, and we appreciate, and with Caltrans, and we appreciate the opportunity to participate. I want to thank SSTI for setting this up, and I think it's a good conversation. We're hopefully looking to get input from others as to what their thoughts might be on how this could play out, given that this is our first run at this effort. I am the Deputy Director, as has been mentioned, for Planning and Modal Programs, and this particular effort for 743 is being led out of our Division of Transportation Planning at headquarters. Really, for us at Caltrans, this is a little bit of, I think Kate mentioned that it's a paradigm shift, and it's indeed a paradigm shift. We're approaching this from the perspective of how it cuts across the various functional units within the department. And so one of the first things we had to do in terms of responding to this is to pull together a team of folks across the department, from maintenance and operations planning, our project delivery folks, and of course our legal side too, to contribute to the collaborative discussion that we've been having with OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, in developing the guidelines as they've evolved over time. We look at SB 343 from two perspectives. One key perspective is as a lead agency under CEQA that delivers projects. We deliver transportation projects, obviously, as a state DOT, and we have obligations as a lead agency under CEQA to meet. But also, we look at SB 743 from the perspective of being a responsible accommodating agency under CEQA as well, as we review the effect of projects, local land use projects, or other projects on the state highway system as the owner-operator of the system, and trying to be good stewards of that asset. We have the obligation to look at what potential impacts projects might have on the system. What are we doing in response to 743 besides just having this gasp of what are we going to do now that we don't have LOS? I think we've quickly determined that it's in alignment with the efforts that have been underway for a few years now within the department to promote a more sustainable system in terms of transportation in California, and that effort has led to revisions of our mission and our vision. That this then fits within that same continuum of trying to get to a sustainable system, and whatever we can do. And I think that's really the thrust of 743 from what you've heard from the two earlier speakers, is that this is intended to get at sustainability, and that's really where our mission is also pointed. So we've really appreciated the collaborative working relationship that we've established over the last about 9 months now, working with OPR on this effort and having that early conversation about what we do with this. So what we've done essentially is have this regular meetings and check-in with OPR on where we're going and how we might bring the department along with what we've done. I mean, if you can imagine that we've relied on LOS as a basis for assessing impacts and mitigation on projects for the longest time, and now we don't have that option anymore. How we pivot to do something different was a major effort, and so we've had the benefit of consulting across the board with internally, but also having these conversations with OPR, tending to look at what the potential might be for not just the traffic impacts, but for other things like air quality and of course the work that we need to do from the perspective of modeling and forecasting as well. And so we've reviewed the draft guidelines and provided enough, I think, from many respects, we provided a lot of input to OPR to get the guidelines to where it is today. We see some challenges, obviously. Whoops, did I go too far? We see some challenges, obviously, to not having LOS as a metric for assessing impact on the CEQA. We still have to continue to use LOS for other things. It's still in play for federal requirements and things that VMT does not quite support. So LOS is not necessarily going away, but there's a real need now to look beyond LOS and look at the traffic analysis that comes forward for any project to try and assess how we might be able to assess other impacts without the benefit of LOS. From our perspective, when we do projects now, we also have to imagine that those projects will have potential for additional mitigation that we didn't anticipate, that we wouldn't have anticipated in the current project development process that we have. So as we look at our projects, VMT, additional VMT results from those projects may trigger mitigation that we didn't used to have to anticipate, and so those could lead to additional cost on the capital side. But I think part of the guidelines also offer some potential options for mitigation that I think you'll see when the guidelines get published. So those are some challenges that we have in front of us, and we're working to sort of take those in stride. On the local development review side, like I said, we typically review projects for potential impact on the state highway system as a responsible agency under CEQA, and also as part of the CEQA requirement of projects that come to us for encroachment permits. Typically, we would pursue mitigation for those impacts on our system based on the LOS impacts or degradation impacts of those projects, typically tied to LOS. And the mitigation that comes from that typically are in form of fees that are assessed based on the LOS degradation that will then hopefully help solve the problems, either have intersection improvements, have ramp widenings or some other off-system, and we typically also recommend other off-system improvements that can take trips off of the state highway so that you wouldn't have those level of service impacts. And so that's the typical approach that we would have taken. Not having that, now we've got to look at the traffic analysis to try and compel other ways to make those assessments. I think in terms of the fees and the discussions that we've had, we could still see where the LOS basis might be there, but you couldn't use it as a CEQA element. But at least it'll give you a sense of how some fees might be assessed. I think the bigger issue for us is when you're dealing with operational and safety issues, VMT might not be the most obvious way of determining that. And so one of the things that we have to do in the process going forward is to look at the analysis that comes forward, the traffic analysis that comes forward, and find ways to determine what the VMT, what the potential elements of that study might be that would indicate what operational and safety problems there might be in the presentation of a project or a proposal, and how we might want to solve that in terms of impact to the system. 743 now assumes that infill development will not have any impact. I think that was part of what Chris presented. Will not have will not have an impact on the system when you have an infill development. And that, I think that's for us, it seems almost easier to accept, because for the most part, where infill development tends to happen is in congested areas, and any more loading on the freeway is really not adding any more problem on the fact that the freeway is already jammed at that point anyway. There's really no way to assess the development, so that's something we necessarily should be looking away from, and I think 743 basically compels that now. So the bottom line is the traffic studies will be looked at very closely to provide valuable data that we can use to make assessments beyond using LOS to make that determination. So the solutions that are obvious to us right now is, one, we need to retool the basis of our analysis, and two clear documents that guide that are the traffic impact study guide, which we use in general, and we work in concert with both the development industry and cities and counties, the lead agencies, to basically come to terms with. This is the guide that indicates what we're looking at when we do a review of a local project, and that guide needs to be updated to take out the LOS element of it. So that's work that we have in front of us as the first order of business. We also internally within the department have to revamp our transportation analysis guide, which is the basis for how we do our traffic analysis on the projects that we're proposing. So those are two things that are right in front of us in terms of where we go next. And the discussions that we've been having internally and across the board with OPR and others, I think, are going to be important in setting that up. We need to work very closely as we go forward, advise the TIS guide and the transportation analysis guide. We need to work very closely with regional partners and cities and counties to make sure that we're covering all bases and meeting the needs of the system. Steps that we're taking, other steps that we're taking to accomplish those two key elements, and some of the work that will lead to the update of the TIS guide and the traffic analysis, transportation analysis guide, are a little bit longer term, so we're not going to have that overnight. We need to, one, improve our modeling base, and Chris alluded to the development of the statewide interregional model that we've been working on. That's been delivered, but we also need to come up with interim guidelines, and we're working on what those would look like. As we do that with the eye, looking forward to a long-term set of guidance to replace the TIS guide and the transportation analysis guide. We will also be looking at what potential we have for research to sort of improve the analytical tools available to us to make sure that we're doing right by one, being good stewards of the system, but also making sure that as we look at our projects that we're able to determine as best as we can what kind of VMT loading those projects will have. And finally, I think critical to all of this is making sure that we take the time to set up training programs to bring everybody else up to speed within the department that's affected by this. We've had a small group, very multidisciplinary group, dealing with this from the signing of the law to this point. That group now needs to expand into bringing in some of the other folks that are involved in actual project delivery and also local development review into the current conversations we're having. So training becomes very key, and training actually has to go beyond just the department. That we need to be part of that training process for our partners as well. I think that's all I have. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to to participate in this conversation and look forward to feedback and questions, I assume.
Well, thank you very much. That was very informative. I learned a lot about this process since I'm not in California. I do want to remind people that if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat box and we will go through those. Again, the chat box should be on the right side of your screen. If you don't see it, you can look for the little orange arrow at the top right of your screen, and you should be able to pull out that chat box and type in a question. And to start off, we do have a couple of questions. And I'm not sure who wants to take this, but what has been the local government or MPO response? Have you gotten any feedback on this? Do people like it? Do they think it's a good idea? Have you gotten pushback? I don't know who wants to.
Probably Chris would be best to answer that because he's had the most interaction.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. It's been there's certainly jurisdictions that are highly in favor of this. And there are jurisdictions that have concerns about it. I would say that the jurisdictions who, in general, you would who we know to be and who you might expect are kind of pushing the curve and really focusing on doing more infill development and transportation efficient development and building their transportation networks in a low carbon, environmentally friendly, et cetera way have been really supportive. In fact, we're kind of egging the process on from the get-go. And there's certainly some cities who there's a legitimate concern here in California, and I suppose this is probably across the country, that any transition will require a development of new methodologies, and some cities don't have a lot of capacity, so there's concerns about that. And we're going to be working pretty hard over the next several months to provide as much guidance as we can and help folks out in making that transition. The MPOs have largely been supportive. So we have a law here in California, SB 375, which has MPOs account for the greenhouse gas emissions that their future scenarios are projected to create. And so this is I think pretty widely seen as facilitating the implementation of that. It's pointing, when we get so the regional planning is done, and then as projects come along, an LOS a metric in environmental review has then gotten in the way of doing a lot of the things that the sustainable community strategies under SB 375 have forwarded. So it's I think pretty widely seen as an alignment with our other state policy.
Okay, great. And just several people asked a procedural question. Yes, we will have the slides up on our website, on SSTI's website. Tomorrow sometime we will also have a recording of the webinar up on the website. Several people asked that, so I thought I'd just cover that. And it looks like we have some questions from possibly some folks in California. They wanted to know, the CEQA reform was supposed to come out July 1st, and they wanted to know if there was a reason for the delay and when some sample guidelines might be available.
I can speak to that again. This is Chris. Yeah, we were supposed to come out July 1st. The statute had us, and we were ready to do so. And then some additional internal concerns were raised, and we've been delayed in kind of setting up the conversations necessary to have to forward that. I expect that they'll be out soon, but we don't have a firm date yet. I would anticipate in the next couple weeks you're pretty likely to see them now.
Okay, thanks. So I think that several people might not be as familiar with this legislation. So somebody asked about whether this applied to all areas or only specific areas. So maybe you could just go over which areas are going to be using VMT and if LOS is still going to be used in other areas.
I can take that one as well unless anybody else wants to. Chris Ganson again. So the law specifies that that LOS is no longer to be a CEQA metric within within transit priority areas, period, and unless our guidelines specify it in general throughout the state. So in order for LOS to be retained, we would need to find that it's the best metric for environmental review. And we've gone to a lot of folks with that question, where is there a reason for us to maintain LOS in environmental review in certain project types or in certain places in the state? And we have gotten replies that LOS is familiar. It's something that we are used to using, that people care about, traffic and delay, which absolutely they do. But we haven't seen any compelling cases of why LOS should be maintained in our environmental law. Now, to be clear, at this point, the local government, so the law specifically allows local governments to continue to use as part of their police power LOS in their planning and in their permitting and in their fee program. So that isn't affected, and everything we've looked at to us seems that that is a better place for congestion and LOS planning to occur. It's a place where the trade-offs can be made, where if you are going to invest in roadway capacity, you can think across the fiscal, environmental, and vehicle delay issues. But we were unable to identify a project type or a place in the state where LOS made sense in environmental review. So we haven't been able to specify to retain it in any particular place or project type. And so yes, VMT would apply as the transportation metric statewide.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we actually had a couple questions about interaction with FHWA. One person wanted to know what the reaction of FHWA was to this change, and someone else wanted to know about the relationship between CEQA and NEPA. I'm not sure if that person's in California or not, but maybe you could explain CEQA as a state law as opposed to NEPA, which I believe is national, and the relationship between that for FHWA.
This is Kate. I can quickly take that. The national environmental, NEPA is a national environmental law. CEQA is our own unique California Environmental Quality Act, which was passed in 1970 and has had many, many changes since then. They are distinct, though there's some overlap, and we actually generally have to abide by both in our projects in California. Both land use projects and transportation projects certainly have to follow NEPA if there's federal dollars involved, and then also go through CEQA. CEQA tends to be, generally a little more stringent and specific, kind of its own animal with many challenges for kind of moving forward with ironically, with sustainable projects. But that's the distinction.
Okay, great. And in general, how has the interaction with FHWA been on this change? Are they in favor of it? Do they have no opinion? That was something else someone wanted to know, how they felt about it.
I would say that's to be determined. I don't know, Kome, if you have any.
Yeah, it's not quite determined yet. I'm not sure that I don't know that we've given them the full benefit of a review, because most of the discussions we've been having have been very internal in just trying to iron out how this might work. For sure, our projects will still have to satisfy all the disclosure requirements of NEPA, so LOS will probably feature in the NEPA documents that we do anyway. So I'm not so sure that Federal Highways will have any different feel about it, but we haven't really had full conversations with them about the implications of 743 on the CEQA.
Okay, great. And then someone asked actually sort of a process question, and they wanted to know how you decided to make this change via legislation versus an internal DOT initiative. How did that come about, and who was pushing for it as a legislative initiative?
Chris, can you?
Yeah, I can speak briefly to that. The bill was Senator Steinberg's, and he's the champion of a lot of environmental legislation. I would say there was pretty broad support of folks from MPO, the MPO community, from in NGOs and such were pushing for this. This actually going in doing this through legislation is actually the product of a longer process. There was stakeholders have been raising this to OPR for probably a decade or so. The bad fit of LOS in our environmental law, and so there was an attempt in 2009, but there were concerns that the transition couldn't be made for legal reasons without statutory authority. So that came about, and we're working on it now.
Okay, great. And then someone else actually asked if there was a map, or how are the transit priority areas determined where VMT is the metric?
The transit priority areas, we've had some mapping, and in the last word is the lead agencies under CEQA, so the city or county, whoever is approving development for land use projects, makes the final determination on whether where the transit priority area is. But of course, we're anticipating that the MPOs will provide substantial assistance in helping mapping those, and they've already provided us with some kind of draft maps and interim maps as we've been charting the way. Now, those transit priority areas and another part of 743 provide for streamlining for projects that are in transit priority areas if a specific plan has been already done. So they're really relevant to that. We're not looking at this point at a differentiation in transportation metric on whether you're in a transit priority area or not, although we are likely to use that geography as part of the presumption of less than significant impact to help streamline those sorts of projects into the kind we want to see more of and the kind that cause the least transportation impact.
Okay, great. Well, we did run just a little bit over time, and I know that all three of our speakers are very busy. And if anybody's joining us from the East Coast, I know it's already 5:30 there. So we're going to go ahead and finish off the presentation, or I should say close out the presentation. But I do want to remind everybody that the slides and a recording of the webinar will be up on our website tomorrow. All the contact information for the speakers are in those slides. So if you have further questions, you can reach them via their contact offline. And we also do invite you to sign up for the SSTI e-newsletter or to follow us on Twitter. We do have webinars throughout the year. You can both sign up for the newsletter and also follow us on Twitter and find all of our past webinars, articles, and resources on our website, which is ssti.us. And thank you so much to Kome and Kate and Chris for the webinar today. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.